Hi everyone. So today we're looking at the origins of agriculture, systematic agriculture, and the corresponding agricultural revolutions, or the Neolithic Revolution initially, and then the subsequent revolutions that we look at as we progress through time. So let's get started. I'll try to keep this concise and to the point. Before agriculture, though, we look at the idea of hunters and gatherers, and for a long time we've sort of become very comfortable with our existence as agricultural peoples, that we look at the advancement of systematic or the agriculture or the Neolithic Revolution, and we look at that as a huge step or advancement for mankind. And oftentimes that's been looked at where the hunting and gathering societies would be considered to be less civilized or not as complex, when in fact, as we've moved through and discovered and learned more about the hunting and gathering peoples throughout history, and even the few that are in existence today, that their societies are much more complex than we understood initially. And some of the things that we thought we understood were actually fallacies about their diets, the complexity of their lives, the difficulties of their lives, when in fact some of the things that we sort of aspire to today, leisure and comfort and sort of a security, were something that they enjoyed to a fair degree. But if we look at most of the human history and look at the timeline of human history, for most of that we were, as a people or a species, hunters and gatherers, and it was a pretty simple, basic diet, and you had a wide variety of food sources depending on where you were. The local diversity is varied throughout the world. But as we developed agricultural sources, it became a food supply that was very stable. Even today, there's still some hunters and gatherers today. There's only about 0.05% in the whole world, or about 250,000, and this is a pretty small number, and yet there's still conflict. That even if we look at American history, you could look at the conflicts as the United States expanded. The conflicts we had with Native Americans, and our attempts to sort of have them assimilate or adopt the culture of a settled lifestyle of an agricultural society. And even though many of those Native Americans societies used agriculture very systematically, the kinds of agriculture that we use in the Western development is very different. Even though today there are still few hunting gathering societies, and yet there's still conflict as global population increases and there's more strain on resources, and as we look at commercial or wide-scale farming techniques, we're seeing some conflicts as the agricultural industry and settled societies start to come in direct contact with some of these existing hunting and gathering societies that remain. As you look at in South America, South Africa, in parts of South Africa, and in Australia, we can still find some very small populations living this very different lifestyle than that we know today. Another aspect of this, and this is coming in the next unit, is what agriculture actually represents to human societies, regardless of hunting and gathering or in terms of an agricultural society. What does it actually mean? Because when we think of agriculture, most people think of food, probably think of plants like wheat or soybeans, something that's very common, corn, to our sort of local culture. But we don't often think of it as feed, as food for the animals or the livestock that we produce, or fiber, things that we actually look at as a way of weaving things, whether it's clothing or other, going back to the ancient Egyptians, paper, for example. Or more recently, with some scientific advancement, is an alternative fuel. Something like ethanol has grown rapidly, and not only with corn as a fuel, but switchgrass, and even to the point where they're even looking at algae as a way of creating a sustainable, renewable type of fuel from living things. In terms of the economic aspect, what we want to know is the levels of activity. Now, we'll come back to this in the development unit, but there are 5 levels: in the primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, and quinary. Basically, the primary level of development or economic activities would be just taking the resources that exist in the natural world and putting them to use. Whether that's a food source or basic resources that we would use, take them and use them as would be. So maybe just taking the wood or the trees and using it as fuel, or taking the natural growing fruits or vegetables or things that would be able to be consumed for sustaining human populations. Another one would be looking at secondary. This is where you start adding human investment into the process. And so when you look at, with each step, if you think of it like a ladder or a stairway, with each step you're adding additional human inputs. And so secondary, it oftentimes is processing, taking those raw materials, those natural resources, and turning them into something, generally using a lot of labor. It's usually labor-intensive tasks and activities. Manufacturing on a broader economic scale would fit this picture of secondary economic activities. Tertiary activities are the ones where we start to see processed materials and goods, where those manufactured goods, we start looking at finding a way of selling it and on a wide scale. We call this commodification. And if you think about the things that we have turned into goods that would have been, not that long ago, would have been unheard of to sell as in the way that they are, things like at McDonald's you can get a bag of an apple that's sliced up in a little baggie, or a bottle of water. Something as simple as water being commodified into something that is turned into billions of dollars a year in our local economies. The quaternary level, and you see these asterisks, quaternary and quaternary are sometimes combined, but they also represent the highest level of economic activity. And essentially what these represent are the innovations, the human ingenuity, the things that are helping advance human societies, understanding the world we live in, using new technologies, using new techniques to take advantage of resources, and to make things that we couldn't make before. And so it's really the leading edge of understanding and becoming more innovative in our world today. As we mentioned before, the hunting and gatherers that existed prior to the Neolithic Revolution, or this first agricultural revolution between 10 and 14,000 years ago, lived a fairly nomadic, simple lives. That they basically moved with the food, and they were able to supply the things they needed for the small groups that they generally roamed with. Their families, and extended families around 50, usually not more than about 50 people. But eventually the idea or the process of domestication started to take root. And it happened sometime around maybe about 14,000 years ago, somewhere between 10 and 14,000 years, that you started to see this process take hold, where purposeful planting or agriculture actually started to become developed. That the understanding of seeds and the protection, the water, to be able to plant them, to water them, and to create a sustainable and permanent food source that you could count on. That instead of having to follow the animals and hope that you caught food or found food, that you would have something waiting. And what that has meant, or traditionally has meant for human societies as it's been understood, is that it has allowed for the greater advancements or the more complex advancements that we know in human society today. And so when we looked at this in these places, as they highlighted in Guns, Germs, and Steel, and as we looked at in class, that these places happened around the world at about the same time, within a reasonable proximity of time. And they generally spread, the crops and agriculture that was used was spread along latitude. That the common climates, that when we started to look, the influence of the natural environment, the environmental landscape, had a great influence on the types of agricultural development that existed and that we see today. Initially, it was just simple things: protecting the food that the plants with fences or terracing, to take advantage of better, to get more of a yield out of a terrain or maybe a physical landscape that wasn't very suitable for agriculture. Natural fertilizers, basically manure, as we started to domesticate animals, a perfect way of fertilizing and creating a more fertile land or soil for these crops to grow. Basic things like weeds, things that would have been detrimental to the growth of these plants, started to emerge. Eventually, we see the use of plows, even though the first real steel plow, which was a huge advancement, didn't happen until much later, several thousand years later. One geographer, Carl Sauer, talks about that. He, in the different hearths of agriculture, that he predicted that those places would be where agriculture would emerge, where it could emerge, where he would call the land of plenty. In other words, places where there were enough resources and food sources and things that people could experiment, that they could try and fail and still be able to survive. It wasn't likely that someone would start to experiment with a new way of life in the middle of a desert where you're uncertain whether or not you're going to have food or water or the resources you need to survive for an extended period of time. So he talked about that happening in the land of plenty. He also looked at the idea of what agricultural meant to the cultural landscape. Now, in Guns, Germs, and Steel, you saw that Jared Diamond was seen as, and has been framed very much as an environmental determinist. Now, while he would disagree with that, I think some of the things he talked about sort of framed the idea of what environmental determinism is. That when he looked at Guinea and he looked at how much further behind they were than the West, and how he tied it back to the fact that the types of agriculture and the fact that they had no beasts of burden or domesticated animals that could be domesticated as beasts of burden, how that limited their ability to grow and advance and to develop the kind of wealth we see in Western society today. But Carl Sauer actually looked at it and said, that's true to some extent, but it's not really limiting to what human societies are capable of. And in fact, one of the things he was more focused on is more of a sustainability, that he looked at agriculture and noticed how it had a distinct impact on the cultural landscape, and how that if he was actually concerned about things like the institutions of capitalism and central government would ultimately be bad for the natural environmental diversity of the earth we live in, and eventually be difficult, also harmful to cultural diversity, that local diversity would be diminished and more uniform landscapes would exist. And as we looked at previously, that can be very devastating to different environments, considering the geography, the climates, the resources available, when everything turns into a uniform sort of situation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It's just a cartoon. I thought that was pretty interesting, funny in my weird kind of way, but we'll move on. So just a brief thing, you can stop here if you'd like, just to pause on here. This is something we revisited before. But as you're going through the text, I think really, especially in this agriculture unit, taking the time to understand the analysis that can be done and what the distinctions between the different climate types and how it aligns with the different types of agriculture that we're going to see, and even if we were to extend it to the types of crops that we would actually see being known for in various regions. If we were to take another layer, we could also add economic wealth. I think we could see some pretty stark contrasts and comparisons that would be pretty transparent once if we were to make those things. And so briefly looking at this, and I mentioned this in class, that being familiar with the Köppen climate system and the basic distinctions. This is going back to Unit 1, but something you should be familiar with. But you can see where the natural sort of boundaries are of these different environments. And when we add the types of agriculture, I think it's an interesting combination. That if you look at sub-Saharan Africa and you look at in South America, where you see humid low latitude or tropical climates, the kinds of agriculture you see are very distinctly similar in the types of subsistence agriculture that we see. And the same as if you look across in the desert areas, whether you're looking at the western half of the United States, or if you're looking at North Africa, or even the central inland part of Australia, you see this that unhospitable to real agriculture. And so if you were to take the time and just kind of look at and make some more comparisons there, I think it'd be a good activity or a basis for some analysis. As we talked about before, those cultural hearths have sort of been redefined as we learn more about these different societies and learn more archaeologically over time. And you can see here the hearths that are thought to have been the 5 major hearths that brought about the initial change in agriculture. And the diffusion it took and the types of crops that you started to see emerge from these different regions. And you see in different time periods. This also corresponded with the domestication of animals. So just as we started to control the reproduction and the growth and expansion of different plant life, we saw the same thing with animals. I mean, the fact that we could start to control the life cycles of animals and then to use them not only for food, for protection, for beasts of burden, was a huge advancement in human society. To lift some of the burden, that's why they're called beasts of burden oftentimes, was a huge advancement that you can see that started to take place corresponding with this movement into agriculture. And again, as Jared Diamond pointed out in Guns, Germs, and Steel, those hearths in particular were very clear in the Middle East and Southwest Asia, where you saw the majority of these beasts of burden and animals being sort of their hearth, and how that would allow for the early expansion and sort of the wealth that was created in ancient Mesopotamia. As we move forward and we look at more today, more current status of agriculture, an interesting landscape on a global scale, that if we look at the percent of labor force in agriculture throughout the various continents of the earth, not only does this tell us what percent of people are in agriculture, but it also indicates something else. Whether we consider the climate or we consider the economic development, what we'll see, and as it talked about in Chapter 10, was a distinct variance between the more developed countries and the lesser developed countries, or the MDCs and LDCs. And so when we start making